in 1923, in a coal town buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains. 3 men walked 7 miles in the dark before sunrise to a stone building that wasn't supposed to exist. They found inside. It was not money. It was not anything the 4 most powerful families in Harlan County ever wanted the world to know about. And 11 men had already died to make sure of that. Before we go any further, where are you watching from right now? What city? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. Genuinely means the world to us to see where these stories are reaching. This story has 3 layers, and you need all 3 to understand what really happened in Harlan County. The first layer is a coal miner named Thomas Aldridge, who arrived in town with $11 and no plan beyond survival. The second layer is what he found sealed behind a wall of mortared stone 700 feet underground, 4 words scratched into rock by someone who never signed their name. The third layer is a secret those 4 words were protecting, a secret that predates Harlan County, that predates the coal company, B, that predates every deed and every lease and every name on every courthouse record, a secret that goes back centuries, okay? And the families who controlled Black Mountain were willing to bury 11 men alive before they let anyone reach it. Most people who clicked on this video will stop watching in the first 2 minutes. It's fine, because what I'm about to show you, the ledger entry, the sealed deed language, the letter a dead surveyor wrote before they silenced him, that's not for everyone. But if you stay, you'll understand why 3 men walked into the dark that morning and why, by Friday, they were running for their lives. The mountains of eastern Kentucky did not welcome strangers. They tolerated them, absorbed them into the fog and the coal dust in the particular silence of hollows where sound died before it could carry. They did not welcome them. The old-timers understood this. They had been born inside that silence, okay? And they carried in their bones a knowledge that no amount of money or ambition could purchase, that Black Mountain gave nothing freely, and that everything taken from it had a price attached that was not printed on any company contract. They knew this, and still, the men came. It was 1923. The coal boom had transformed what was once a scatter of Appalachian homesteads into a city with real ambition. Brick storefronts on Central Street, a granite-faced bank, 2 hotels that filled every Monday with new arrivals. The population had tripled in less than a decade. Men had come from Virginia, West Virginia, as far south as Alabama, drawn by the promise of steady wages and the particular species of hope that only desperation can manufacture. Thomas Aldridge was one of them. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, hands that told his entire biography, calloused from years of farm work in Wise County, Virginia, scarred across the left palm from a fence wire accident at 19. He stepped off the Louisville and Nashville railroad car on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of his wife Elenina and their daughter Ruth, and $11. The last of everything after the drought took the second harvest in a row. Thomas was not a dreamer. He was a man who had learned through sustained and patient suffering that hope was a luxury best kept small. He did not arrive in Harlan expecting prosperity. He arrived expecting survival. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company occupied a 2-story brick building at the corner of Central and Mine Street, its entrance worn smooth by the boots of thousands of men who had stood exactly where Thomas now stood, hand in hand, waiting to be measured. The hiring manager, a heavy-set man named Cecil Pratt, looked Thomas up and down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assessed thousands of bodies for their utility in underground spaces. "You claustrophobic?" Cecil asked, not looking up from his ledger. "No, sir," Thomas said. "You got a problem taking orders from a foreman, even when those orders don't make sense to you?" Thomas hesitated, just half a second. Cecil caught it. "Every honest man hesitates on that one," Cecil said. "Good. I'll take honest over agreeable any day. Sign here." Thomas signed. He was assigned to shaft number 4, $3.20 per day, 6 days a week, more money than he had made in any single month of farming. That night, by lamplight in Mrs. Dora Combs's boarding house on Mound Street, Thomas wrote to Elalinia, "The work is hard, but the pay is real. I think we made the right decision. I think this place might be the answer." He sealed the envelope. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it was thin and unrestful. The kind of sleep that leaves a man more tired than when he began. Shaft 4 descended at a 30-degree angle into the base of Black Mountain. Thomas's crew consisted of 6 men: Junior, Bates, 24, wiry, perpetually cheerful in the unsettling way of someone who had stopped calculating risk; Odell Maynard, 47, a Harlan native who had worked this mountain since he was 16, and who spoke about the mine the way a man speaks about a difficult relative, with familiarity and unresolved tension; Calvin Price, a black man from Middlesboro who kept to himself during breaks, but worked with a focus and precision that foreman Craig acknowledged only through silence, the particular silence of a man who respects competence but has no vocabulary for saying so. And then there was Pete Sorrell. Pete was 53, the oldest man on the crew. Gray beard, eyes the color of creek water in winter. He had been born in Harlan County. His father had worked this mountain. His grandfather had logged the ridges above it. Pete carried knowledge about this place that no company survey had ever recorded. In Thomas's first week, he said almost nothing. It was on the 5th day, a Friday, cold enough that breath clouded even inside the shaft, that Pete leaned toward Thomas during lunch break and spoke in a voice low enough that only Thomas could hear. "You notice they never give us work orders for the North Tunnel," Pete said. Thomas looked up from his biscuit. "What North Tunnel?" Pete chewed slowly. "Exactly," he said, and returned to his food. On his 3rd week, Thomas was assigned to inspect the support timbers in the lower sections of shaft for a solitary task. Quiet, almost peaceful. He was working in the lowest section, lantern casting long shadows across coal-black walls, when he stopped. A passage branched off to the left at an angle he had not seen on any shaft diagram. The timbers framing it were far older than those in the main shaft, almost petrified, darkened by decades of moisture and pressure. Someone had framed that passage with care and considerable skill. Someone had also worked very hard to seal it. The entrance was blocked by a wall of rough-cut stone, mortared with a mixture of concrete and coal dust. It was not a collapse. It was not a natural obstruction. It was deliberate. Thomas raised his lantern toward the upper corner of the sealed entrance. Beneath a layer of grime, scratched directly into the rock face above the stones, someone had left 4 words. Thomas stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of the mountain pressing down through hundreds of feet of rock above him. He thought about Pete's words, spoken quietly over cold biscuits 5 days earlier. "You notice they never give us work orders for the North Tunnel." He picked up his tools. He completed the inspection. He said nothing to anyone. That night, for the first time since arriving in Harlan, Thomas did not write to Elalinia. He sat at the small desk in his room and stared at the blank page while the fog rolled in from Black Mountain, thick and low, swallowing the street outside his window. 4 words scratched into rock by a hand long gone, belonging to a man whose name Thomas did not know, whose reasons Thomas could not yet understand, but whose warning Thomas was already certain had been meant to be taken seriously. Ray Dunford was Thomas's one genuine friend in Harlan. He lived 2 rooms down at Mrs. Combs's boarding house, was from Knoxville, educated enough to have read several books, and opinionated enough to have views on all of them. He was the kind of man who made a difficult place bearable by making it interesting, right? It was Ray who first mentioned the families. "You know who actually runs this town?" Ray said, one evening on the boarding house porch. "Not the coal company, not the mayor. The Consolidated is just the machinery. The real engine is for families who've been here since before the Civil War. The Holbrooks, The Warfields, the Cordeals, and the Dunns. Elias Holbrook had arrived in Harlan County in 1831, a land surveyor from Richmond, Virginia, with a government contract and an eye for mineral deposits that his official duties conveniently allowed him to identify and quietly acquire. The Warfield family arrived a decade later. Augustus Warfield had stripped the lower ridges of Black Mountain with industrial efficiency throughout the 1840s and 1850s, replanting nothing, and used the proceeds to purchase mineral rights contiguous to Holbrook's holdings. The Cordeals and the Dunns were older Harlan County families, Scotch-Irish settlers whose roots in the region predated any formal land ownership system. They had simply been there when the surveys arrived and had been shrewd enough to ensure their presence was translated into documentation. By 1890, the four families collectively controlled access to the most productive coal seams in eastern Kentucky. When the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company was incorporated in 1901, its founding documents listed all four families as principal stakeholders. "What's strange," Ray told Thomas, "is that none of them live in town anymore. About 15 years ago, all four families moved out to their country properties within about 2 years of each other." Why? Ray picked at a loose thread on his jacket. Nobody seems to know, or nobody seems to want to say. Ray had pieced together the family's history from courthouse records and from one remarkable source, Miss Alma Pigg, 71 years old, retired school teacher, had taught in Harlan County since 1879, in the unsentimental manner of very old women who have outlived most of the people they were supposed to protect. She was willing to discuss things that younger residents would not. The families moved out of town in 1908 and 1909. Miss Alma told Ray, seated in the one chair in her parlor not occupied by periodicals. All four of them within 18 months of each other. "What happened in 1908? Ray asked. Miss Alma looked at him with the measured patience of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children to think before they spoke. "In March of 1908, she said, 11 men died in Shaft 7 of the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company. Official cause? A gas explosion. The mine inspector's report described the explosion as consistent with accumulated methane and a lamp malfunction. But Shaft 7 had been in operation for 4 years without a single gas incident. The ventilation was considered exemplary. The foreman had an impeccable safety record." She paused. "Lua, and the 11 men who died were not distributed randomly throughout the shaft. They were all working in the same section." Thomas told Ray everything about the sealed passage and the 4 words above the stone wall. He had not intended to tell anyone, but Ray's information had changed the geometry of the situation. The sealed passage was no longer simply a curiosity. It was connected to something. 11 dead men, for families who left town within 18 months of those deaths. A warning scratched into rock by someone who had known what was on the other side. They went to Pete Sorrell on a Sunday afternoon, his rented room above the hardware store on Cumberland Avenue. He stepped aside to let them in without a word. Pete listened while Thomas described the sealed passage and while Ray laid out Miss Alma's account of the 1908 explosion. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the way a man sits when he is controlling something internal and does not want it visible. "My uncle worked Shaft 7, Pete said finally. "He wasn't one of the 11. He was sick that week. Influenza. They sent him home 2 days before it happened. He lived to be 78 years old, and he never once talked about what happened in that shaft. Not once did he know what was in the north section." Thomas asked. Pete looked at his hands. "He knew what they were told to do in the north section," Pete said. "He told me that much once, when he was very old, and I think he had decided it didn't matter anymore what he said." "What were they told to do?" Pete looked up. "Remove what they found," he said, and never describe what it was. Not to their foreman, not to their wives, not to a priest. Load it into crates, seal the crates, bring them to the surface. The crates were picked up by men they didn't know and taken in wagons toward Sedan property on the North Creek. The room went very quiet. What was in the crates? The psalmist asked. Pete shook his head slowly. My uncle didn't know, he said. The men who worked that section came out different after a few weeks. Quieter, he said. One man, a fellow named Haskins, started having episodes, shaking, confusion, couldn't remember where he was. The company doctor said it was nerves. Haskins was let go in January of 1908, 2 months before the explosion, Ray said. 2 months before the explosion, Pete confirmed. He stood up then, which Thomas understood as the end of the conversation. At the door, Pete stopped and turned back. I've worked this mountain for 31 years, he said. I have never filed a complaint, never caused trouble, never asked a question I wasn't supposed to ask, okay? I'm telling you this, not because I'm proud of it, okay? But because I want you to understand what I mean when I say this to you now. He looked at Thomas directly. Whatever's behind that wall, whatever the Dunns picked up in those wagons and took to their property on the North Creek, it was worth more to those 4 families than 11 men's lives. And those families have been in this county for 80 years, and they have more reach than you can measure. And they are watching this mountain the same way they always have. He opened the door. Be careful what you go looking for, Pete said. Because in my experience in this county, the men who find things are the men who disappear. Ray went to the county recorder's office on a Wednesday morning when foot traffic through the courthouse was light enough that a man could spend an hour with the deed records without attracting comment. He was looking for the Dunn property on the North Creek. What he found was considerably more than he had anticipated. In the 1861 deed, recorded when Nathaniel Dunn transferred the property to his son Robert as part of an estate settlement, Ray found a clause unlike anything else in the county records. He copied it, word for word, into his notebook, including and especially the subterranean formations known to the grantor, comprising those passages and chambers accessed from the northern drainage, which the grantor has caused to be secured and which the grantee is hereby instructed to maintain in a secured condition, the contents thereof to remain undisturbed and unexamined by any party not previously authorized in writing by the principal families of record. Said authorization to require agreement of no fewer than 3 of the 4 principal families, the whole of this provision to remain in effect in perpetuity, and to bind all heirs and assigns, subterranean formations, passages, and chambers, contents thereof to remain undisturbed. Written in 1861, 62 years ago. Whatever was beneath the Dunn property on the North Creek had been secured, protected, and legally entailed to future generations for over 6 decades. The 4 families had built a formal legal structure around it. They had written it into property law, and 11 men had died. Ray was now certain, because those men had gotten too close to it from the other direction, from inside the mountain, through the north tunnel of Shaft 7. Ray went back to Miss Alma Pig that same afternoon. She was in her parlor reading. She looked up with an expression that suggested she had expected him to return and was simply waiting to see how long it would take. She listened to the deed language, set the notebook on her knee, looked out the window at the bare maple in her front yard. I wondered if that document still existed, she said quietly. You knew about it? I knew about what it referred to, not from reading it, from a conversation I had in 1909, about 6 months after the Warfields left town. She reached into the stack of papers beside her chair with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly where everything was, despite appearances. She produced an envelope, yellowed with age. His name was Foster Dunning, she said, surveyor, retained by the coal company in 1906 to map the deeper sections of Black Mountain for potential new shaft locations. He was thorough, and he was honest, which, in retrospect, made him poorly suited for the assignment. The letter was dated March 14, 1907. The handwriting was small and precise. Dunning wrote that the northern passages of Black Mountain were not simply a series of natural cave formations. He had found evidence of human activity, very old human activity, pre-settlement, chambers that had been used, artifacts of considerable age and apparent cultural significance, structural modifications to the natural cave formations. This story has 3 layers, and you need all 3 to understand what really happened in Harlan County. Whatever was beneath the Dunn property on the North Creek had been secured, protected, and legally entailed to future generations for over 6 decades. The 4 families had built a formal legal structure around it. They had written it into property law, and 11 men had died. Ray was now certain, because those men had gotten too close to it from the other direction, from inside the mountain to the north tunnel of Shaft 7. Foster Dunning's letter, a dead man's confession. Ray went back to Miss Alma Pig that same afternoon. She was in her parlor reading, and she looked up with an expression that suggested she had expected him to return and was simply waiting to see how long it would take. She listened to the deed language, set the notebook on her knee, looked out the window at the bare maple in her front yard. "I wondered if that document still existed," she said quietly. "You knew about it?" "I knew about what it referred to. It's not from reading it. It's from a conversation I had in 1909, about 6 months after the Warfields left town." She reached into the stack of papers beside her chair with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly where everything was, despite appearances. She produced an envelope yellowed with age. "His name was Foster Dunning," she said, "a surveyor, retained by the coal company in 1906 to map the deeper sections of Black Mountain for potential new shaft locations. He was thorough and he was honest, which, in retrospect, made him poorly suited for the assignment." The letter was dated March 14, 1907. The handwriting was small and precise. Dunning wrote that the northern passages of Black Mountain were not simply a series of natural cave formations. He had found evidence of human activity, very old human activity, pre-settlement, chambers that had been used, artifacts of considerable age and apparent cultural significance, structural modifications to the natural cave formations, and a quantity of material he could only describe as records, not written records in any alphabet he recognized, systematic markings on prepared surfaces that indicated deliberate information storage. He wrote, "I believe that what is in those chambers belongs to no family and to no company. I believe it is significant beyond anything that can be measured in mineral rights or property deeds. And I believe that the men who currently control access to it understand this, which is precisely why they guard it so carefully." He had submitted his survey in December of 1906. He was paid for his work and thanked. In January of 1907, the company retained a second surveyor to produce a revised survey. The revised survey made no mention of the northern chambers. Dunning left Harlan County in February of 1907. He died in 1918, and in his final line, he had written, "I do not know what will happen when the mining operations eventually reach the northern section from below. I suspect the families know this is coming. I hope those plans do not involve the men who will be doing the work." Ray set the letter down. He hoped the plans didn't involve the men doing the work, Ray said. "Yes," Miss Alma said. "And then 11 men died in Shaft 7 in March of 1908. "Yes," Miss Alma said again. Her voice was even. She had had 15 years to sit with this. "Why didn't you go to anyone with this?" Ray asked. "Go to whom?" Miss Alma said. "The county sheriff is on a first-name basis with Robert Dunn. The state mine inspector filed a report describing the explosion as an accident. The newspapers in this region are owned by men who understand where their interests lie." She looked at Ray steadily. "I am a 71-year-old schoolteacher in a coal town in eastern Kentucky. I have kept this information alive because I believe that eventually someone would come along who could do something with it that I cannot. I have been waiting 15 years. She picked up her book, which Ray understood as the end of the conversation. "I think you already know this," she added without looking up. "I think you came here today to hear someone else say it." Ray brought everything to Thomas that evening. The deed, language, the letter, the full account of Miss Alma's conversation. He laid it out on the small table in Thomas's room. The lamp turned up high, the window fogged with cold. Thomas read Foster Dunning's letter twice. He sat with it for a long time. "It's artifacts," Thomas said. "Chambers, markings on surfaces. Something old," Ray said. "Something significant enough that 4 of the most powerful families in this county have been protecting it for at least 60 years and killing men to keep it hidden." Thomas was quiet. Outside, the fog had come down from Black Mountain, thick and early, wrapping the street in gray. He thought about Elanina's last letter. It's about Ruth, who was 7 years old and learning to read. It's about the $11 he'd arrived with and the money he had been sending home. And the plan, the careful, modest plan to bring his family to Harlan by summer and build something stable on the wages the mountain paid. He thought about Foster Dunning, who had a wife and 2 children and had made what he called the practical choice and had spent the rest of his life writing letters, confessing to it. "The Dunn property," Thomas said. "How far is it?" 7 miles north, along the creek road. "We go on Sunday," Thomas said. "Before dawn, we look. We don't touch anything. We document what we can." They left Harlan at 4 in the morning on a Sunday in early April. The fog was so thick that a man could walk from Mrs. Combs's boarding house to the end of Mound Street without being seen from 20 feet away. Thomas carried a lantern wrapped in cloth to dim its light, a notebook, and a small camera, a Kodak Brownie that Ray had borrowed from a photographer friend without explaining why. Pete Sorrell was waiting at the edge of town. "Told you to be careful," Pete said. "I didn't say I wouldn't come." Thomas nodded once. The 3 of them turned north and walked into the dark. The road to the Dunn property followed the North Creek for most of its 7 miles, rising gradually as the valley narrowed, the creek growing louder as the road climbed and the water compressed between higher banks. Pete walked ahead. He knew this road. He told them that the Dunn family had stopped using outside labor sometime around 1895, transitioning entirely to workers who lived on the property and who, as far as Pete could determine, had no social contact with Harlan proper. "How many people live on the property now?" Ray asked quietly. 3, maybe 4, Pete said. "Martin Dunn's son manages it, unmarried. He's hired men who've been there as long as I can remember. They come to town for supplies on the first Saturday of every month, regular as a clock. Today is Sunday," Thomas said. Sunday mornings, Martin drives to the Baptist church in Cumberland, about 12 miles, leaves at 7. The hired men don't go, so we have a window. If we're on the property and clear before 7. Thomas checked his watch in the dim light, 4:42. They walked faster. The stone building appeared before the house did. It sat close to the creek, perhaps 30 yards from the water's edge, kept hidden by a stand of white pines that had been planted, deliberately planted in a deliberate arrangement to screen it from the road. It was built of the same gray limestone that composed the deeper formations of Black Mountain. The blocks cut and fitted with a precision that spoke of skilled masonry and significant expense. The roof was slate. The single door, set into the south wall, was heavy oak, reinforced with iron straps, secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. There were no windows. Pete studied the padlock for a moment, then reached into his jacket and produced a short pry bar. Thomas looked at him. "It's 31 years working for men who got rich off this mountain," Pete said quietly. "I think I'm owed a look." The hasp pulled free of the doorframe with a sound like a single knock on hollow wood. The door swung inward. The smell reached them before the light did. It's dry and mineral and very old. It's a smell of stone and something else beneath it that Thomas could not immediately name. It reminded him distantly of the deep sections of Shaft 4, but cleaner, as though whatever produced it had been sealed away from the mine's particular dampness and had preserved itself in the sealed air. Pete uncovered his lantern. Ray lit the second one. The building was a single room, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a stone floor and a vaulted ceiling that rose to about 12 feet at its peak. Along both long walls, built-in wooden shelving ran from floor to ceiling, interrupted at regular intervals by wooden support posts. The shelving was filled, objects arranged with methodical care, not stacked randomly, but organized, cataloged with small, handwritten labels attached to each item or group of items. Thomas moved to the nearest shelf and held his lantern close to the first label. The object beside the label was a stone tool, a hand axe, roughly shaped, dark with age. Beside it, wrapped in cloth that had gone stiff with time, was something flat and rectangular. Thomas carefully unfolded it to reveal a piece of prepared hide covered in markings, systematic markings, rows of symbols repeated and varied in patterns that suggested Thomas was not an educated man in the academic sense. But he had a farmer's practical intelligence and a miner's observational precision. It suggested language, or something that functioned like language. He looked down the shelf. Dozens of objects, hundreds. He looked at the other wall. More shelving, more objects, more labels. Chamber A, Level 2, minus 1,891. Chamber B, Level 1, minus 1,894. Chamber B, Level 3, minus 1,903. These go back to 1847, Ray said from the opposite wall, reading labels in a rapid undertone. The earliest label I can find, 1,847. That's when Elias Holbrook first acquired the mineral rights. They've been removing material from those chambers for 76 years, Thomas said. Schematically, Pete said. He was standing in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. They didn't just stumble onto this. They knew what was here. They've been managing it. Near the back wall, the shelving gave way to a large, flat table. On the table were stacked 6 ledger books bound in dark cloth, labeled by year. The earliest was dated 1851, the most recent minus 1,921. Thomas opened the 1908 ledger. The entries were in a careful, formal hand. Each listed a date, a location within the chamber system, a description of the item removed, and its condition. He turned pages. February 1908, the entries grew more frequent. Multiple removals per week, as though someone had accelerated the pace of extraction. And then, March 4th, 1908, a single entry, in a different hand, darker ink. The letters pressed harder into the page, the way a man writes when his hand is not entirely steady. Shaft 7. North Section crew reached Chamber B, lower access point. Crew leader informed and work suspended pending family consultation. Decision reached. March 6th. Standard protocol. Entry sealed. March 7th. Standard protocol. Thomas stared at those 2 words for a long time. Ray. Ray came to the table. Thomas pointed to the entry. Ray read it. His face in the lamplight went very still. Standard protocol, Ray said. 11 men died on March 12th, 1908, Thomas said. 5 days after the entry was sealed, the 3 of them stood around the table in silence. Outside, the creek ran over its stones in the dark, indifferent, continuous. Ray uncovered the Brownie camera. Thomas held both lanterns at angles that maximized the available light, while Ray photographed the ledger, the 1908 page specifically, and several others that showed the systematic nature of the operation stretching back decades. He photographed the shelving, the labels, the artifacts. He used the entire roll of film, working methodically, moving through the room with the focused efficiency of a man who understands he has one chance in limited time. Pete stood at the door, watching the approach road. When Ray finished, Thomas carefully replaced the ledger exactly as he had found it. He checked that nothing had been moved or disturbed. They backed out of the building. Pete reset the hasp as well as could be managed. Not locked, but positioned to appear locked from a distance. Thomas checked his watch. 6:21, need to move. Pete said. They were 2 miles down the creek road, moving quickly in the strengthening gray light of early morning when Pete spoke. "What are you going to do with it?" Miss Alma said. "Send copies to institutions the families can't reach," Ray said. "Universities, a federal archive, the photographs, the copied deed language, Dunning's letter, packaged together, sent to multiple places simultaneously, so that suppressing one copy doesn't suppress all of them. That protects the information," Pete said. "It doesn't protect you." "No," Ray agreed. "The moment those photographs reach anyone outside this county, the families will know someone was on that property. They will know it was someone with access to information about the 1908 event and the deed records. That narrows the field considerably." Thomas looked at the road ahead, the creek on his left, the mountain visible now above the tree line, its upper ridges dissolving into cloud. "Then we need to be gone before the photographs arrive." Both men looked at him. "Was planning to bring Ila-Lanina and Ruth here in the summer," Thomas said. "I'm going to write to Eleanor today, tell her to go to my brother James. I'll send the photographs and the documents to 3 separate addresses: the State University in Lexington, a federal archive in Washington, and a newspaper editor in Cincinnati that Ray knows." "And then?" Ray asked. "And then I finish the week's work, collect my pay on Friday, and on Saturday morning, I'm on the first train out of Harlan." Pete was quiet for a moment. "I have a sister in Corbin," Pete said. "I've been meaning to visit her." Thomas looked at him. "I think I'll go on Saturday as well," Pete said. The 3 of them walked in silence for a while. "Those people in those chambers," Ray said eventually. "Whoever they were, centuries of occupation, artifacts, records, a whole system of knowledge stored in stone, and 4 families spent 76 years removing it piece by piece and locking it in a stone building on a private creek," Ray said. "It's not studying it, not reporting it, it's keeping it from becoming public," Pete said. "Which is a different thing. Public knowledge means government interest. Government interest means loss of control over the property. Loss of control over the property means loss of the mineral rights. They buried the history of whoever lived in that mountain," Ray said. "To protect a cold lease." No one answered. There was nothing to add. He walked into Harlan as the first church bells of Sunday morning began to ring, and the town around them stirred slowly into its day, unaware of what 3 men had seen on the North Creek before the light came up. Ray developed a film that Sunday night. 12 prints. He divided them into 3 packets, each containing the critical ledger entries, the shelf labels, the room's overall layout, along with the typed summary of the deed language, Dunning's letter, and the documented sequence leading from the 1906 survey to the 1908 explosion. The first packet went to Professor Edmund Hargrove at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. The second went to the National Archives in Washington. The third went to Walter Crane, editor of the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune. Thomas mailed a letter to Ila-Lanina the same morning. "Go to James. Don't wait for another letter. Go now. I will explain everything when I see you. I'm well, and I am being careful. Go to James." The week passed with a surface normality that Thomas found more unsettling than open hostility would have been. And then, on Wednesday evening, something shifted. At dinner, a surface worker named Harlan Blevins mentioned, almost casually, that he had seen Martin Dunn in town. "Thought he only comes in on the first Saturday," someone said. "Usually," Harlan said. And left it there. Thomas kept his face neutral. He finished his dinner. He went to his room and did not write anything. Martin Dunn was in Harlan on a Wednesday, 6 days after the first Saturday. There was no reason for Martin Dunn to be in Harlan on a Wednesday unless something had changed. I thought about the hasp on the stone building's door. Pete had reset it as well as could be managed, but as well as could be managed was not the same as undetectable to a man who checked it regularly. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and calculated the distance from Monday morning to Saturday morning and decided that the distance was no longer acceptable. Thomas found Ray at breakfast Thursday morning. Martin Dunn was in town yesterday. Ray set down his coffee cup. We can change when we leave, Ray said. I can be on the afternoon train today. The lack of hesitation told Thomas that Ray had already been thinking about this. That afternoon, Pete came to Thomas's room at 7 o'clock. He knocked twice, quietly. Thomas let him in. Pete looked at the half-packed bag on the bed. He nodded. Martin Dunn went to the sheriff's office this afternoon. Pete said, I saw him go in. I watched from across the street. He was in there 40 minutes. Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed. The sheriff is not a dishonest man in the ordinary sense, Pete said. He doesn't steal. He doesn't fabricate evidence. But he understands where the weight in this county lies. He has never in 11 years done anything to shift it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I'm leaving on the first train tomorrow, Thomas said. 6:15, before the paymaster opens. The money, Pete said. Doesn't matter, Thomas said. He surprised himself with how clearly he meant it. A week's wages did not matter. Ilalana and Ruth in Wise County with his brother James mattered. The packets in the mail mattered. Getting on a train before Combs developed a specific reason to find him mattered. The money did not matter. I'll be on the 6:15 as well, Pete said. He was already at the door. 6 o'clock. Platform. Thomas did not sleep. He finished packing 12 minutes and then sat in the chair by the window and watched the fog on Mound Street and thought about everything that had happened in the 7 weeks since he had stepped off the Louisville and Nashville railroad car with $11 in a canvas bag. At 5:30, he put on his jacket, picked up his bag, and looked around the small room one last time. He took the photograph of Elanina and Ruth from the desk and put it in his jacket pocket, close to Foster Dunning's letter, which he had carried there since Sunday. He went downstairs quietly, left $2 on the kitchen table for Mrs. Combs, more than he owed, which felt right, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark. Pete was already there, a dark shape at the far end of the platform, his bag at his feet, looking north, up the track. Kay did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Kay, 6:08. Thomas heard footsteps on the platform behind them. He turned. Sheriff Lon Combs walked toward them from the station house end of the platform, tall, unhurried, wearing his coat against the cold. He had a deputy with him, young, hanging slightly back, uncertain of his role in whatever this was. Combs stopped 6 feet from Thomas and looked at him with the measuring expression of a man who has been given information and is comparing it against what he sees. Thomas Aldridge. Not a question. S. You work shaft for at the Consolidated? I do. Combs looked at the bag. Going somewhere. Family emergency. My wife. Cataletta. Combs considered this. Martin Dunn tells me someone entered his property Sunday morning. Storage facility on the North Creek. I don't know anything about that, Thomas said. The fog moved between the platform lamps in slow drifts. Track stretched away to the north, disappearing into gray. Combs looked at Thomas for a long moment. He was, as Pete had said, not a dishonest man in the ordinary sense. He was a man who understood weight and where it lay. He was also, Thomas now saw, a man who was not entirely comfortable with what he had been asked to do on a cold Friday morning at a train platform. The Dunn family, Combs said slowly, has been in this county since before my father was born. They are significant people. Yes, sir. A pause. The distant sound of the train, still several minutes out, moving through the mountain gap to the north. Your wife? Combs said. She in Harlan. No, sir. It's Wise County, Virginia. I'm going to my brother's place. Combs looked at him, at the bag, at Pete, who had not moved or spoken. I don't have cause to hold you, Combs said. The words were careful and deliberate, chosen with a precision that told Thomas they were not accidental. A man can travel. Thank you, Sheriff. Combs nodded once. Ski turned and walked back toward the station house. Ski deputy followed, glancing back once over his shoulder. Thomas breathed. The 6:15 came in on time, its headlamp cutting a tunnel through the fog, the brakes groaning against the cold rails as it slowed into the station. Thomas and Pete were the only passengers boarding at Harlan. Thomas chose a window seat on the west side of the car, away from the platform. He set his bag on the rack above and sat down and looked out at the platform where Sheriff Combs stood with his deputy, watching the train without expression. The train began to move. Harlan's buildings slid past the window, the brick storefronts of Central Street, the steeple of the church whose bell he had listened to on Sunday morning returning from the North Creek, the coal company's office at the corner of Central and Mine, the boarding house on Mound Street where $2 sat on Mrs. Combs's kitchen table. And the buildings ended, and there was only the mountain, Black Mountain, rising above the trees to the east, its summit hidden in cloud, the way it always was, the way it had been every morning Thomas had spent in Harlan. He looked at it until the track curved and it disappeared from his window. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched Foster Dunning's letter. Then he took out the photograph of Ilalina and Ruth and held it in his lap in the gray morning light coming through the window. Pete sat across the aisle, looking forward, his hands on his knees. The train moved north through the fog, through the gap in the mountains, away from Harlan County and its coal and its 4 families and its stone. Building on the North Creek, carrying 2 men and everything they knew, toward whatever came next. Professor Edmund Hargrove received the packet on Wednesday of the following week. He read it in his office at the University of Kentucky, read it again, and then sat for a long time before he picked up the telephone. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune published a partial account 6 weeks later, citing documentary evidence and named sources that included a letter from a deceased surveyor and deed language from public county records. The story named the 4 families, described the 1908 explosion and its timing in relation to the mine crew's proximity to the northern chambers. The Federal Archive acknowledged receipt of the materials in a letter dated May 3, 1923. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company issued no public statement. The Holbrook, Warfield, Cordele, and Dunn families issued no public statement. The Harlan County Sheriff's Office opened no formal investigation, but the materials were in the archive. They were in the university library. They were in the newspaper's records. They existed in multiple places simultaneously, okay? And the thing about evidence that exists in multiple places simultaneously is that it cannot be unmade. It can be ignored, disputed, minimized, buried under the weight of more powerful interests, but it cannot be unmade. Thomas Aldrich arrived in Wise County, Virginia, on a Friday evening in April 1923. He walked from the train station to his brother James's house through the last light of a clear spring afternoon, and Ilalina met him at the gate. He held her and Ruth for a long time without speaking, and when he finally let go and they went inside, he sat at James's kitchen table and told Ilalina everything. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Those people," she said. "The ones who lived in those chambers? Yes. Do you think anyone will find out who they were, now that the documents are out?" Thomas looked at his hands on the table, his calloused hands, the scar across the left palm. "I think someone will try," he said. "That's the most I can say." "Someone will try." Ilalina nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, the Virginia spring moved through the trees, and the evening was quiet. The mountains in the distance were a soft blue-gray in the fading light, gentler than the mountains of Kentucky, less hidden in fog, their shapes clear and readable against the sky. Thomas looked at them for a long time. He thought about Black Mountain, about the north tunnel sealed behind mortared stone, about the chambers below the Dunn property, emptied piece by piece over 76 years. The objects sitting on shelves with paper labels in a careful hand, locked behind an iron-strap door. And he thought about the people who had put those objects in the mountain in the first place, who had prepared those surfaces and made those markings and built those chambers and lived in that darkness long before any Holbrook or Warfield or Cordele or Dunn had ever set foot in eastern Kentucky. Their names were not known. Their language had not been translated. Their history had been removed from its context and locked in a room and guarded at the cost of 11 men's lives. But it existed. The objects existed. The photographs existed. The ledgers existed, sitting on a shelf in a stone building on the North Creek, waiting for a world that might eventually be willing to ask the right questions. Thomas did not know if that world would come in his lifetime. He suspected it would not, but it would come. History moved slowly and against resistance, and at great cost, but it moved. He turned away from the window. 11 men went into the dark in March of 1908. They did not come home. 3 men walked 7 miles in the dark in April of 1923, and what they found could not be buried again. Whatever lived in those chambers beneath Black Mountain, whoever they were, however long they were there, they left behind something the 4 families couldn't remove: evidence, the raw material from which someone someday would build the truth. Thomas watched his daughter read. Outside, the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky, patient and indifferent and permanent, the way mountains always are, keeping their own time, answering to no family, no company, no sheriff, no lease, keeping what they kept, remembering what they remembered. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we make these stories for. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story reached you somewhere strange, somewhere quiet, somewhere late at night, we'd really like to know. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with one person who would understand why a story like this matters. And we'll see you in the next one.